He called me a dial reader from the submarine days. I was the only man certified to restart what he'd just shut down. I was a Marine, actually. But he didn't care enough to read my file. My name is Gary Phelps. I'm 54 years old. I spent 14 years in the United States Marine Corps, Master Sergeant, Combat Engineer, Utilities Chief. I spent another 22 years after that at Vanguard Energy Partners, a nuclear generating station tucked into the hills of East Tennessee. My title was Senior Reactor Operations Supervisor, SRO. That three-letter designation is a federal license issued by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission under Title 10, CFR, Part 55. It's not a certificate you frame and hang on the wall. It's a license tied to me, personally, at that specific facility. The NRC doesn't hand those out because you filled in the right bubbles on a test. They hand them out because they watched you operate under pressure, verified your judgment under simulated failures, and decided you were one of the people they'd trust with a reactor. There were two of us at Vanguard with that license. Me and Tom Hensley, who's 52 and has been there almost as long as I have. 2 out of 340 employees. Brandon Whitmore didn't know that number. He didn't know a lot of things. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I joined the Marines the September after I turned 18. I didn't have a plan beyond getting out of Overton County and doing something that mattered. 14 years later, I had a skill set that doesn't fit neatly on a resume. I could build electrical infrastructure in places that didn't have roads yet. I could troubleshoot generators in the dark by feel and sound. I could keep calm when everything around me was failing, because that's what the Corps beats into you. Not courage, not toughness. Discipline. The discipline to follow the procedure when your hands are shaking. I walked into Vanguard Energy Partners at 32 years old, and I never left. I trained every licensed operator currently on that site, every single one. When they came in green and nervous, I sat with them during their first live evolutions and talked them through it. When they made mistakes in simulation, I debriefed them until they understood not just what went wrong, but why. I wrote the supplemental training protocols that the NRC cited as a model program during our 2019 review. Those protocols aren't in any manual the company published. They're in a 3-ring binder on my desk, handwritten, updated quarterly for 22 years. The plant ran clean because I made sure it ran clean. Not because the systems were perfect, because I caught the imperfections before they became events. You want to know what that costs a man? In 2018, we had a cooling system anomaly. Primary loop pressure transient, middle of the night. I was on shift when the alarms cascaded, and I stayed. I stayed for 71 consecutive hours. I ate from the vending machine in the auxiliary building corridor, peanut butter crackers, and a sun-drop soda every 6 hours. The cold glass bottles they keep in the machine by the security desk. I slept 40 minutes on the floor of the SRO office with my boots on and my pager on my chest. By the time the transient was resolved and the NRC resident inspector signed off on our corrective actions, my son David had graduated from high school. He sent me a photo from the ceremony. His mother was standing next to him. I wasn't. I still have that photo. It's in the glove box of my truck, underneath the logbook where I've recorded every oil change and tire rotation since I drove that F-150 off the lot in 2008. He was 18. I missed the whole thing. I don't know why I keep it there. Maybe because that's where I was sitting when I finally saw it, parked in the plant lot at hour 73, engine off, too tired to drive home, looking at my son's face on a phone screen and realizing I'd traded something I couldn't get back for a company that would never know what it cost me. David's 24 now. He's a high school history teacher and assistant varsity wrestling coach. He turned out fine. Better than fine. But he turned out that way because his mother did the work I should have been there for. My marriage ended 12 years ago, and if I'm honest, it ended long before the papers were signed. You can't keep telling a woman you'll be home by dinner, and then not show up for a decade and expect her to keep the light on. She stopped asking where I was sometime around year 6. By year 10, she'd stopped caring. I don't blame her. I was married to that control room. If you've ever given everything to a company that wouldn't give you the time of day, hit that like button and subscribe. Every day brings completely new stories, each one more intense than the last. 8 months ago, a kid named Brandon Whitmore showed up at Vanguard Energy Partners. 26 years old. Wharton, MBA. The CEO's nephew. His title was Director of Strategic Operations, which is a title that means nothing at a nuclear generating station because there is no such role in the NRC's organizational requirements. It was invented for him. A parking spot for the family's golden boy while he rotated through the company's divisions to pad his resume. You could smell his cologne from the access corridor before you saw him. He wore a slim-fit suit that belonged in a Manhattan nightclub, not a Reactor building in Tennessee. His teeth were impossibly perfect. Veneers, the kind that cost more than Tom Hensley's truck. He checked his Apple Watch during every conversation, even when the NRC resident inspector was talking. Especially when the NRC resident inspector was talking. His first week, he called a meeting to discuss what he called the synergy pipeline for Vanguard's operational future. I sat in the back. He used the phrase, automate the human bottleneck, 4 times in 11 minutes. I counted. He had a slide deck with animations. He had a vendor on speakerphone from a software company I'd never heard of. He had a vision for paradigm shift in how nuclear facilities were managed. He did not have a single question about how the reactor actually worked. I knew what he was. I'd seen 3 ownership changes in 22 years. I'd seen consultants come and go like weather fronts. But Brandon was different. Brandon had authority he hadn't earned and confidence that had never been tested, and he had his uncle's name behind every word he said. Tuesday morning, 10 a.m., quarterly NRC readiness meeting. The room was the primary review space, windowless, fluorescent lit, a massive whiteboard on one wall, covered in my handwriting from the last evolution debrief. The NRC's regional team was on the speakerphone. Tom Hensley was to my left. 4 junior operators I had personally trained were sitting along the far wall. Brandon walked in 9 minutes late, coffee in one hand, phone in the other. He didn't apologize. He sat at the head of the table, the chair I'd been sitting in for NRC briefs since before he was in high school, and launched into his automation initiative. Right there, in front of the NRC, without clearing it through the operations department, without running it past me or Tom, without understanding that this meeting had a federally mandated agenda that doesn't include sales pitches for software companies. The NRC lead on the speakerphone went quiet. I could hear her breathing. Then Brandon turned to me. He smiled with those perfect teeth and said, loud enough for the phone and the room and every junior operator who'd ever watched me hold that plant together. No offense, Gary, but we don't need dial readers from the submarine days anymore. We need systems that don't take bathroom breaks. The room went still. Tom Hensley's jaw tightened. I saw his hand flatten against the table. I didn't say anything. Not because I didn't have words, because I had too many, and none of them would have mattered to a man who thought reactor operations was a slide deck, a dial reader from the submarine days. I was a Marine, not Navy. I'd never served on a submarine in my life. He'd invented a biography for me that fit his narrative. The old sailor, squinting at gauges. A relic of analog thinking, and he'd said it in front of federal regulators and my own people. An HR coordinator named Linda Marsh was standing by the door. She'd been there to take minutes. When Brandon finished, she looked at me with both hands gripping the back of the chair in front of her, knuckles white, like she was bracing for something. She knew. Everyone in that room knew, except him. The NRC lead asked if Vanguard had submitted a 50.59 screening for the proposed automation changes. Brandon looked at me like I was supposed to answer. I looked at the whiteboard. After the meeting, Brandon stopped me in the corridor. He put his hand on my shoulder. I don't like being touched. Gary, I want to be straight with you. The future of this plant is digital. I need team players who can get on board with that vision. Or I need to clear the runway for people who can. You've had a great run here. 20-some years. But legacy infrastructure includes legacy people. Legacy people. I looked at his hand on my shoulder. Then I looked at him. I understand perfectly, I said. And I walked to my truck. I sat in that F-150 for 11 minutes. Engine off. Windows up. The parking lot was half empty because first shift hadn't fully rotated in yet, and the morning was already warm enough to make the cab feel close. I could see Brandon's Porsche Macan from where I sat. White, leased, parked across 2 spots near the admin entrance. Paper dealer plates still on it like he'd just driven it off the lot yesterday. Maybe he had. I didn't care. I opened the glove box. David's graduation photo was right where it always was, underneath the logbook. I didn't look at it. I just felt the edge of it with my thumb, the way you touch something to make sure it's still real. Then I drove to the country kitchen off Highway 58. Betty Clark set down a sundrop without me asking. Cold glass bottle, still wet from the cooler. She dropped off a plate of eggs and toast and left me alone in the back booth, cracked vinyl sighing under me as I settled in. ESPN was on mute on the corner TV. Some baseball highlights. I didn't watch. I sat there for 2 hours. I didn't call anyone. I didn't draft a resignation letter. I didn't rehearse a speech. I just sat with what had happened and let it settle into the shape it was always going to take. I wasn't angry. That's the thing people don't understand. Anger is fast and sloppy, and it makes you do stupid things in hallways. What I felt was slower than that. Colder. It was the same thing I felt at hour 60 of that cooling system anomaly. When your body is past exhaustion and your mind goes quiet, and the only thing left is the procedure. The next correct step. Brandon Whitmore thought I was trapped. He thought a 54-year-old divorced SRO in East Tennessee with no fancy degree and no connections had nowhere to go. He thought the mortgage and the routine and the 22 years of sunk time made me furniture, something you rearrange or throw out when you're redecorating. He was wrong about all of it. But the part he was most wrong about was this. He thought the plant ran because of the plant. The turbines, the cooling loops, the digital control systems, the backup generators, hardware, software, infrastructure. The plant ran because of me and Tom Hensley. And now he'd told me in front of my people and the NRC that I was a relic. So I decided to become exactly what he asked for. I would do my job description, the hours on my shift schedule, the tasks on my assignment sheet, nothing more. No more weekend calibration checks. For 22 years, I'd driven in on Saturdays to verify instrument calibrations that weren't technically due until Monday. I did it because an extra 48 hours of drift on a pressure transmitter made me uncomfortable. Nobody asked me to. Nobody knew I did it. Nobody was going to notice when I stopped. Not right away. No more 2 a.m. phone calls. Junior operators had my cell number, and they used it. 3-4 times a week, someone would call with a question they should have known the answer to, but didn't. Because the training manual didn't cover the judgment calls and the institutional memory that separates a competent operator from a safe one. My phone would ring, and I'd walk them through it in the dark, sitting on the edge of my bed in my underwear, patient as a man can be at 2 a.m., because getting it wrong at a nuclear plant isn't a write-up. It's an event. No more informal mentoring. The 4 junior operators who'd been in that room when Brandon called me a dial reader, I'd been working with each of them for months, prepping them for their recertification evaluations. The NRC requires periodic requalification. The written exams are standardized. The simulator evaluations are not. Those simulator scenarios are where operators either prove they can think under cascading failure conditions or they don't. My 3-ring binder, the one on my desk, handwritten, updated quarterly, contained every scenario variation I'd developed over 2 decades, every debrief, every failure mode the plant had actually experienced, not the textbook ones, but the real ones, the ones where the symptom doesn't match the procedure, and you have to think. That binder stayed on my desk. I just stopped opening it for anyone except myself. I went home at the end of my shift, on time. For the first time in years, I was pulling out of the lot before the sun went down. The first week, nothing happened. That's how it works with invisible labor. The absence doesn't register immediately because everyone assumed the work was self-sustaining. They thought the instrument calibrations held because the instruments were good. They thought the junior operators were competent because the training program was solid. They thought the 2 AM questions didn't happen because there was nothing to ask about. The second week, Tom Hensley sat down next to me in the control room during a shift change. He didn't say anything for a full minute. Then, "You stopped doing Saturdays." "I'm following my shift schedule." He looked at me. Tom has a face like a topographic map, every year etched into it. He'd watched me carry this plant through 3 ownership transitions, 2 NRC special inspections, and 1 cooling transient that could have made national news if I hadn't caught it. "They're going to fail Resert," he said. "That's not my assignment." Another silence. Then he nodded once, slow, but the way a man nods when he's not agreeing with you, but understanding something larger. "What are you going to do?" he asked. "My job," I said. "Exactly, my job." Tom looked at the whiteboard on the control room wall. My handwriting was still all over it. He looked back at me. "Then I'm going to do mine," he said. By the end of week 2, 2 of the 4 junior operators failed their recertification simulator evaluations, not by a little. The NRC evaluators documented procedural breakdowns during cascading failure scenarios, the exact scenarios I'd been coaching them through for months using material that existed nowhere in the company's official training library. The evaluators noted, in writing, a marked regression in operator decision-making under complex transient conditions. The NRC opened a formal review. I was in the control room when the resident inspector came through. He was a man I'd known for 9 years. We'd been through 2 refueling outages together. He looked at me like he wanted to ask a question. He didn't. He looked at the whiteboard instead, at the debrief notes from the last evolution I'd led, and he wrote something in his notebook. Brandon Whitmore found out about the NRC review the way he found out about most things. Late, from someone else, without context. He called an emergency meeting in the review room. Same windowless box. Same fluorescent light. Same speakerphone. He used the word unacceptable 4 times. He asked who was responsible for training. Someone pointed out that the supplemental training protocols weren't part of the official program. They were informal, developed and maintained by a single individual. Brandon said, "Then formalize them, download them, whatever." There was a silence in that room that had texture, the kind of silence that happens when everyone present knows something the person talking doesn't. The protocols weren't in a database. They weren't on a server. They were in a 3-ring binder on my desk, and the institutional knowledge behind them was in my head, built over 22 years of watching this specific reactor do things that aren't in any vendor manual. Nobody told Brandon that. He didn't ask. Week 3, Thursday. Overcast sky pressing down on the hills like a gray lid. The air outside felt heavy and still. The automation vendor, the software company Brandon had been championing since his first week, sent a technical team to begin their implementation assessment. 3 engineers. They spent 2 days in the control room. They were professional, competent within their domain, and visibly uncomfortable. On Thursday afternoon, the lead engineer asked to meet with Brandon. I wasn't in the room, but Tom was on shift, and the door to the review room doesn't seal properly. Sound carries in that corridor better than people realize. The vendor engineer said, clearly and without hesitation, what was on page 412 of their own 500-page technical implementation manual. The document Brandon had apparently never read past the executive summary. The automation system could not legally authorize reactor protocol overrides. Under NRC Title 10, CFR, Part 55, every automated override sequence required physical authorization from a senior reactor operator licensed specifically for that facility. The software didn't replace the SRO. It required one at every critical decision point. The system Brandon wanted to use to automate the human bottleneck couldn't function without the bottleneck. Tom told me the vendor engineer's exact words. Mr. Whitmore, your 2 site-licensed SROs aren't optional personnel. They're a federal regulatory requirement. Without at least one active SRO, this facility cannot legally operate at power. There was a pause. How many SROs does the site currently have? The vendor asked. 2, someone said. Another pause. Longer. And how long to license a new one? 18 to 24 months, minimum. The NRC doesn't expedite. Tom said Brandon's face went the color of the whiteboard behind him. That evening, Tom Hensley drove to my house. He stood on my porch with his hands in his jacket pockets, and he said 6 words. I'm resigning. Monday. You should too. I looked at him a long time. I know, I said. He nodded, turned, walked back to his truck. That was the entire conversation. The following Monday morning, 2 resignation letters arrived on the plant manager's desk. Mine and Tom's. 30 days notice each, exactly per our employment agreements. Professional, clean, by the book. The plant manager's name was Russell Pemberton. He'd been decent to me for most of 20 years, but he'd let Brandon operate unchecked because the CEO was Brandon's uncle, and Russell wanted to keep his job. He called me within the hour. Gary, now let's talk about this. There's nothing to talk about, Russell. My notice is filed. We can address whatever concerns. My concerns were addressed in the quarterly NRC readiness meeting. Tuesday, 10 a.m. The one where your director of strategic operations called me a dial reader in front of federal regulators. Silence. I understand there were some comments made. 30 days, Russell. I hung up. 18 minutes later, my phone buzzed. Then again. I looked at the screen. 3 calls from numbers inside the Vanguard admin building. A text from Russell. Please call me back. Then a call from a 423 number I didn't recognize. Then one from a 202 area code, Washington, D.C. I set the phone face down on the kitchen counter, and I opened a Sundrop. The NRC downgraded Vanguard's operating status on a Wednesday. I wasn't at the plant when it happened. I was at the country kitchen, back booth, Sundrop going warm on the table, because I'd been reading the newspaper. The actual newspaper, the Crossville Chronicle, folded in thirds, and lost track of time. Betty had refilled my water glass twice without saying a word. She could read a room better than anyone I'd ever worked with, and that includes NRC inspectors. The downgrade was inevitable. With both site-licensed SROs in their 30-day notice period and no replacement candidates within 18 months of certification, the NRC had no choice. The plant couldn't legally operate at full power. They issued a confirmatory action letter, which, for anyone outside the industry, and is the federal government's way of saying, we are no longer asking, we are telling. Vanguard dropped to 60% capacity immediately. The contracted power purchase agreements, $2.3 billion across the Tennessee Valley grid, had penalty clauses tied to operational status. Those clauses activated the moment the downgrade hit the Federal Register. $450,000 per day in penalties, not per month, per day. By Friday, Vanguard Energy Partners stock had fallen 19% in 5 trading days. The utilities board called an emergency session. The CEO, Brandon's uncle, released a statement about temporary operational adjustments that fooled no one who could read a balance sheet. Brandon Whitmore was still at the plant. I know because Tom told me. Brandon had stopped wearing the slim-fit suits. He'd switched to khakis and a button-down. Like a costume change would make him look like he belonged in a reactor building. He'd been calling the NRC regional office directly, trying to negotiate an expedited licensing pathway for replacement SROs. The NRC told him what anyone who'd spent 5 minutes reading Title 10, CFR, Part 55, already knew. There is no expedited pathway. The process takes 18 to 24 months because it's supposed to. Because the federal government doesn't cut corners on who they allow to authorize reactor operations at a nuclear generating station. The whole point of the regulation is that you can't rush it. His Apple Watch must have been buzzing nonstop. I hope so. Thursday of that third week, the day everything landed. I drove to the plant one last time. Not because I had to. I still had days left on my 30-day notice. But the plant manager, Russell Pemberton, had asked me to attend what he called a resolution meeting. His voice on the phone had the careful steadiness of a man holding something fragile. The meeting was in the primary NRC review room. Same sterile, windowless box. Same fluorescent tubes buzzing overhead. Same massive whiteboard, still covered in my handwriting from the last evolution debrief. The dry erase markers fading at the edges, but nobody had erased it. Nobody knew what to replace it with. Russell was there. The site's legal counsel, a woman named Catherine Foley, was there. 2 representatives from the utilities board were on the speakerphone. The vendor's lead engineer was there. The same man who'd read page 412 out loud to Brandon 3 weeks ago. He sat with his hands folded, looking at the table like a man at a funeral. And Brandon was there. He was sitting in the chair at the head of the table, the same chair he'd claimed the morning he called me a dial reader. His veneers caught the fluorescent light when he shifted his jaw, which he did constantly. He wasn't checking his Apple Watch. For the first time in 8 months, he was paying attention. I sat down, didn't take the head of the table, didn't need to. Russell opened with a careful summary of the situation. The NRC downgrade, the penalty clauses, the stock impact, the 18 to 24-month licensing timeline for replacement, SROs. He used the phrase operational continuity crisis and looked at me when he said it. Then Brandon spoke. His voice was different, flatter. The buzzwords were gone, or mostly gone. He said the plant was prepared to make significant accommodations to retain essential personnel. He said the word essential like it hurt coming out. Catherine Foley slid a document across the table, a retention package. I didn't open it. Gary, Russell said, we'd like to discuss terms. I let the room sit in silence for a moment. The speakerphone hissed softly, the board members breathing in a conference room somewhere in Nashville. You had terms, I said. They were the ones where I showed up every Saturday for 22 years without being asked, where I answered my phone at 2 a.m. 3 times a week, where I wrote training protocols the NRC called a model program, and nobody in this building thought to formalize them, because it was easier to let me do it for free. Those were my terms. Why, you didn't even know they existed until I stopped. Nobody spoke. Brandon leaned forward. Gary, I think we got off on the wrong foot. You called me a dial reader from the submarine days, in front of the NRC, in front of operators I trained. I looked at him. I was a Marine, Brandon, not Navy. 14 years, Master Sergeant, combat engineer. But you didn't read my file. You didn't read the NRC regs. You didn't read your own vendor's implementation manual past the executive summary. Page 412 would have saved you all of this. The vendor engineer closed his eyes. The answer is no, I said. Tom Hensley and I have accepted positions with Apex Power Solutions. Our combined compensation packages total $4.8 million. They read our files. I stood up. Good luck with your synergy pipeline. I walked out of that room the way I walked in, quiet, steady, the same pace I'd used in every corridor of that plant for 22 years. I didn't rush. I didn't slam anything. I passed the control room on my way to the exit and looked through the glass at the console I'd sat behind for more hours than I could count. My Fluke 87V multimeter was still in my locker. I'd pick it up later, or I wouldn't. It had done its work. The overcast sky outside was the same dull gray it had been all day, heavy and still. I got in my F-150, turned the key, and pulled out of the lot for the last time. What happened after was math, the kind that doesn't forgive. The NRC's confirmatory action letter triggered a full inspection cycle. During that inspection, the agency identified 14 procedural deficiencies that had been masked by, their words, not mine, informal but highly effective supplemental training and calibration practices maintained by senior operations personnel. 14 deficiencies, every one of them something I'd been catching and correcting quietly, on my own time, for years. The penalty clauses bled Vanguard at $450,000 a day for 47 days before they negotiated a partial capacity agreement with the grid authority. That's $21.15 million in penalties alone. The stock never recovered to pre-downgrade levels. 3 institutional investors filed derivative suits against the board for failure of oversight. The utility's CEO, Brandon's uncle, resigned under pressure 6 weeks after I left. And he cited personal reasons. The board cited a forensic review that traced the operational crisis directly to unauthorized interference with licensed operational protocols by unqualified personnel. Brandon Whitmore was terminated the same day his uncle resigned. His title, Director of Strategic Operations, was dissolved. It had never been a real position, and everyone knew it. His LinkedIn went quiet. Last I heard, he was interviewing at a consulting firm in Atlanta that specialized in energy sector strategy. I don't know if they hired him. I don't think about it. The NRC issued a formal finding that named the root cause of the operational degradation as leadership decisions that systematically undermined site-specific institutional expertise. That finding is public record. It will follow Vanguard through every license renewal for the next 20 years. Apex Power Solutions treated Tom and me like what we were, assets, not line items. They gave us relocation packages, signing bonuses, and a training mandate to build the same kind of supplemental program I'd run at Vanguard. This time, it was in the budget. This time, it had a staff. This time, someone read the binder. Tom called me his second week at Apex. He said, "You know what's different here?" "What?" "They gave me a desk with a window." I almost laughed, but the part I remember most happened on a Tuesday evening about a month after I started at Apex. Dusk. The sky outside was turning a bruised purple, the way it does in Tennessee, when the day doesn't want to let go, but knows it has to. I was sitting alone in the bleachers of David's high school gymnasium. My phone was powered completely off, not silenced, not in my pocket, off, dead. The first time I could remember doing that in 22 years. Long shadows from the upper clear-story windows stretched across the wrestling mats below, cutting the gym into slats of gold and violet. David was on the mat with the varsity team, running them through takedown drills. He was patient with them, methodical. He corrected their form without raising his voice, showed them the movement once, then stepped back and let them try it until they got it right. He coached the way I'd trained operators, not by telling them the answer, but by building the judgment to find it themselves. He didn't know I was there. I hadn't told him I was coming. I just showed up, in the way I should have been showing up for the last 20 years. A kid shot a double leg, and David caught him mid-level, adjusted his grip, and walked him through the finish. The kid hit the mat, popped up grinning. David patted his shoulder. Then he looked up at the bleachers, scanning, and he saw me. He didn't wave, didn't call out. He just nodded. Once, the way Tom nods, the way men nod when they don't need words, because the thing they're saying is bigger than language. I nodded back. Then I sat there in the quiet and watched my son do the work he was built for, and I realized I was finally doing the same thing. Not working, not fixing someone else's reactor, just sitting in a gym at dusk, watching the kid I missed too many years for, with nowhere I needed to be and no phone waiting to ring. I still owe him that fishing trip to Dale Hollow Lake. 6 years I've been promising it. I told him last Sunday, and he said, "Name the weekend, Dad. I'll clear it." I'm going to clear it too. For the first time in my life, I can. They say you can't automate judgment. That's true. But here's what they don't tell you. You can't automate the man who shows up at 2 a.m. because he gives a damn. You can build every system in the world, stack software on top of software, put a Wharton MBA in a slim-fit suit, and hand him a title that doesn't exist. But when the alarms cascade and the pressure transient doesn't match the procedure, and everyone in the room is looking for the person who knows what to do next, that person is either there or he isn't. And you don't get to decide he's a relic and then ask him to save you. Not anymore. If you enjoyed this story, hit that like button and let me know what you think in the comments. And if you haven't subscribed yet, subscribe and ring that notification bell to get alerts about new stories like this one. Thanks for watching. See you in the next video.